There are moments in history when the fate of nations hangs not on treaties or thrones, but on a single, thunderous charge that defies logic, outmatches fear, and rewrites the destiny of continents. And on a September afternoon in 1683, on a field outside Vienna, such a moment arrived. Carried not by diplomats or armies, but by 3,000 warriors whose wings roared like a storm across the earth. They were the Winged Hussars of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, horsemen so feared, so relentless, so impossibly effective that their enemies swore angels of death had descended upon the battlefield. Armed with lances longer than any cavalry in Europe, armored in glittering steel, their wings rattling like thunder as they rode, these men were the final hope of a besieged Christian world, staring down the full might of the Ottoman Empire. For 2 months, Vienna had stood on the brink of collapse. 80,000 Ottoman soldiers encircled the city, starving it, battering its walls, tunneling beneath its foundations. If Vienna fell, the road to Germany, France, and the heart of Europe would lie open. But just as the Ottomans prepared their final assault, a distant cloud of dust rose on the horizon. At first, it looked unimpressive, a faint smudge against the afternoon light. But then the ground began to tremble. The dust thickened. The horizon darkened. And from the forests of the Kallenberg Mountain, 3,000 winged hussars emerged, not as a scattered band of riders, but as a unified wall of cavalry, descending like a tide of iron. What happened next would become the largest cavalry charge in human history, a moment when the outnumbered shattered the unstoppable, when 3,000 men broke an army 26 times their size, and when the balance of power in Europe shifted in the span of minutes. This is not just the story of a battle. It is the story of a charge so decisive, so violent, so impossibly heroic that it became legend. A story of faith against empire, steel against numbers, destiny against doom. This is the story of the Winged Hussars and the day they saved Europe.
But to understand why the Winged Hussars mattered, why their charge was not merely a victory but a turning point, we must first understand the giant they faced, the Ottoman Empire at the height of its power. In the 17th century, few empires on earth could rival the Ottomans. Stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of the Balkans, from the Black Sea to the gates of Persia, the empire was a vast mosaic of peoples and cultures unified under a single crescent banner. Its armies were legendary. Its wealth flowed from 3 continents. Its sultans sat in palaces that shimmered with gold. And at the heart of its power stood its military. The Ottoman army was a machine, not one of chaotic conquest, but of logistical precision. It fielded elite janissaries, trained from childhood, massive siege artillery capable of reducing stone fortresses to dust, and cavalry from across its territories whose speed and numbers overwhelmed countless enemies. By the 1680s, the empire believed it was unstoppable, and perhaps, until that September day, it was. Europe at this time stood divided. Kings quarreled, principalities schemed. The Holy Roman Empire, theoretically united, was fractured in practice. France, under the Sun King, sought dominance. Spain was weakening. Austria was isolated. And Vienna, the imperial capital, stood as the glittering gateway between East and West. For the Ottomans, conquering Vienna wasn't just a military objective, it was destiny. Vienna had resisted Ottoman attacks before, most notably in 1529. That earlier siege had failed, but it had taught the empire a dangerous lesson. Vienna, if taken, would open Europe like a door on rusted hinges. Now, more than a century later, the Ottomans returned, stronger, more prepared, and determined to finish what their ancestors had started. At their head stood Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Grand Vizier, brilliant, ambitious, and dangerously confident. He marched north with an army so large that villagers watched them pass for days. When the Ottomans reached Vienna in the summer of 1683, they encircled the city with tens of thousands of soldiers. The message was unmistakable. Vienna would fall, and with it, Europe. But destiny has a way of bending toward the unexpected.
On July 14, 1683, the siege began. Vienna was not ready. Its walls were old, its garrison was small, its food stores were limited, and the Austrian Emperor, Leopold I, had fled the city to gather reinforcements elsewhere. Inside Vienna's walls remained only 11,000 soldiers, exhausted, understaffed, and underfed, along with tens of thousands of civilians. Against them stood an Ottoman force of 80,000 men, supported by artillery, cavalry, and thousands of sappers trained in the terrifying art of undermining fortress walls with explosives. Day after day, the Ottomans hammered at Vienna. Cannons pounded its ramparts, mines detonated beneath its walls, blowing entire sections into the air. The defenders fought back with everything they had: muskets, grenades, makeshift barricades, but each day the situation worsened. By August, starvation haunted the streets. Diseases spread. Horses were eaten. Dogs disappeared. Even leather straps were boiled for food. Still, Vienna did not surrender. But everyone knew the truth. Vienna had weeks left. At most. Europe watched, fearful, silent, divided, except for one king, far to the north, who refused to let Vienna fall. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a nation battered by war and internal struggle, ruled a man whose courage would reshape the destiny of Europe, King John III Sobieski. He was no ordinary king. A veteran commander, a tactician of genius, a leader beloved by his soldiers. Sobieski understood something few others did. If Vienna fell, Poland would be next. So when Austria begged for help, he agreed, even though the journey to Vienna would be long, dangerous, and exhausting. In August 1683, Sobieski gathered an army of 30,000 men, 3,000 of them winged hussars, and began a march that would become legendary. Through forests, across rivers, over steep mountain roads, pushing their horses to the brink. The winged hussars, among the finest cavalrymen in the world, rode with armor that glinted in the sun and wings made of wood and eagle feathers attached to their backs or saddles. These wings weren't decorative. They produced a rattling, thunderous sound that frightened enemy horses and soldiers alike. Every step closer to Vienna was a step closer to danger. But Sobieski pressed on. He traveled so fast that Ottoman scouts repeatedly miscalculated his arrival, believing the Polish army still hundreds of miles away, even as it approached the outskirts of Vienna. By the first week of September, the hills around the city shook with the distant sound of hoofs. The final hope of Europe had arrived.
On the morning of September 12, 1683, the combined Allied army took position on the Kahlenberg Mountain, overlooking Vienna. It was a breathtaking sight. On one side, Polish cavalry, German infantry, imperial troops, local militias, all gathered in a desperate coalition of necessity. On the other, the massive, disciplined, entrenched Ottoman army. Kara Mustafa Pasha laughed when he saw them, a patchwork Christian force arriving too late, too tired, too disorganized, or so he believed. He did not know that Sobieski himself commanded the right wing, the side where the winged hussars waited. The sun rose,
The air thickened. The drums began. The battle for Vienna and for Europe was about to begin. The Winged Hussars would not charge immediately. First, the infantry had to carve a path. For 9 brutal hours, the Allied armies fought uphill battles, forest skirmishes, and desperate pushes against entrenched Ottoman forces. Cannons roared, smoke filled the sky, fields burned. Slowly, painfully, the Allies gained ground. By late afternoon, the Ottoman lines began to bend, and far to the right, at the edge of the battlefield, Sobieski watched. He had waited for the exact moment. He knew cavalry charges were deadly, but only when unleashed at the perfect time. As the sun dipped lower, he saw what he needed. The Ottomans were stretched thin, their infantry was exhausted, their formations were breaking, and their attention was fixed on the German infantry in the center. Sobieski turned to his cavalry officers. It is time. The Winged Hussars formed ranks, lances lowered, banners snapping in the wind. 3,000 cavalry stood shoulder to shoulder. Alongside them, thousands more German and Austrian cavalry prepared to charge. The field sloped downward. The Ottoman camp lay below, unaware of the storm about to hit them. Sobieski rode to the front. He drew his sword, the same sword he would carry into the heart of the Ottoman camp. He pointed it toward the enemy, and with a voice that echoed across the hillside, he shouted, "Forward! God is with us!" The charge began. At first it was a trot, then a canter, then a full gallop, a tidal wave of hooves and steel rushing down the mountain at terrifying speed. The wings of the hussars rattled like thunder, their armor flashed in the sun. The sheer sound was overwhelming. Ottoman soldiers looked up from their trenches and froze. Many had never seen the Winged Hussars before. They had heard stories, but nothing could prepare them. The cavalry hit the Ottoman lines with the force of a hurricane. Cannons shattered, shields splintered, men were thrown aside like grass before a scythe. The Ottoman front collapsed instantly. Those behind tried to flee. Panic rippled through the ranks. The once mighty Ottoman army, 80,000 strong, broke under the weight of 3,000 riders. Sobieski himself led the charge into the center of the camp, cutting down defenders as he went. In minutes, the battle was over. The Ottomans fled, their siege collapsed, Vienna was saved, and Europe breathed again.
Kara Mustafa Pasha fled the battlefield, defeated, humiliated, and shocked. His army, once considered invincible, had been shattered. The siege of Vienna ended in disaster for the Ottomans, beginning a long decline from which the empire would never fully recover. And the Winged Hussars? They became legend. Their charge at Vienna became the defining moment of their history, a feat unmatched before or since. Jan Sobieski entered Vienna as a hero. The emperor himself bowed in gratitude. A letter was sent to Rome announcing the victory. It ended with the now famous words, "Venimus, vidimus, Deus vicit." We came, we saw, God conquered. The victory at Vienna changed history. The Ottoman advance into Europe stopped permanently. The balance of power shifted. The Commonwealth earned global respect, and the Winged Hussars cemented their reputation as the greatest cavalry in history. Their wings, once feathers and wood, became symbols of courage, discipline, and impossible bravery. Today, historians analyze tactics, generals study strategy, tourists visit battlefields, but the truth remains simple. 3,000 riders saved a civilization. History remembers kings and empires, dates and treaties, but sometimes history turns not on crowned heads or signed documents, but on a single charge, a single decision, a single moment when courage defeats certainty. On that September afternoon in 1683, when the ground shook beneath the hooves of the Winged Hussars, the world changed. And in that thunder, echoing across the battlefield, across Vienna, across Europe, one truth resounded. Even the impossible can be broken when men choose to ride into destiny.